Hi, I'm Dr. Joe Hall-Patton, or Cypher on this channel, and we need to talk about the history of assassinations in the United States. I study American violence, more specifically social violence, as in the hazy realm between interpersonal and martial killing/destruction. So, the recent murder of Charlie Kirk in the most public of settings has sent the nation reeling, trying to explain the situation by grasping at vitriol, rather than understanding the history which led us to this point. Well, that's what I'm here to talk about, because this increase in violence is by no means unprecedented and reveals a very important problem plaguing our society as a whole. In order to understand the significance of such events, we must look beyond individual perpetrators' motives or specific victims' status beforehand, and instead look at the indicators of societal difference. Violence is a manifestation of change, whether by implementation, resistance, or as a symptom. A major adjustment within society makes itself apparent when people come to blows en masse. I hope by the end of this, you'll be able to take a larger view than the specifics of any singular crime. Because of the gruesome circumstances that prompted this discussion, I think it's prudent to donate the proceedings of this episode to the Brady Campaign, which is dedicated to preventing gun violence, and began from very similar circumstances. The assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1981 also wounded Press Secretary Jim Brady, which he would eventually succumb to decades later. His namesake campaign funds research into preventing the very thing he had become a victim of, and proposes appropriate legislation. So the revenue from this episode, if I can manage to keep it monetized, is going to that charity, and you can donate with the link below too. As an aside, let me first thank my patrons. Much like many YouTubers, my viewership has dropped so precipitously that I fear for the future of this channel. So this patronage is the only way to keep the whole thing going. And in an attempt to comply with YouTube guidelines, there will be no graphic imagery. Finally, there is of course a selective bibliography in the description below and footnotes on screen, but I am speaking from a decade of studying social violence, so this connects to a lot of different things, as you'll see as we go through. Anyways, let's talk about the history of American assassination and its meaning for society as a whole. Firstly, the definition of assassination is surprisingly fraught. It's not interpersonal murder, lynchings, manslaughter, and other things like that. The victim has to be of some sort of prominence, which is already difficult to define, and killed for that prominence, often in a very public manner. That's why poisoning is not a form of assassination, nor somebody slaying their famous boss for firing them. Generally, it is only an assassination if the killing is successful, so attempts are merely that. Attempts. Furthermore, crime-related killings like mob hits are generally not considered assassinations here for simplicity's sake, but could easily be included in other definitions. So this is a pliable category, which is why so many politicians currently bemoan a rise in political violence. Another hazy term. Generally, we don't mean police shootings or military actions when people say political violence. They mean riots, assassination, terrorism, and insurrections. It is violence committed with the intention of affecting politics. As explained earlier, I prefer the term social violence, but we have to keep this semantic fuzziness in mind as the discussion progresses. Each has a discrete meaning, but all are very malleable. Perhaps the biggest misconception promulgated in reaction to recent events is that political violence has no place in America. To the contrary, it is an integral part of our history, and assassinations have been extraordinarily common. Of the 45 men who've held the presidency, 4 of them met such a fate, as in 9%, and kinda making the highest office in the land also the most dangerous. Attempts on their lives have also been very common, with the first one coming in 1835 when a crazed gunman tried to take out Andrew Jackson, but misfired and had the crowd overwhelm him on the steps of the Capitol, including Davy Crockett among them.
King of the wild frontier.
They had to peel Jackson off his assailant before he beat the wannabe assassin to death. There's been too many attempts to recount here, but I should note that Reagan had to undergo surgery because of wounds he received. Until that point, there was what many called the curse of Tippecanoe, which foretold that a president would die in office every couple of decades, which has largely held true since the first to fall to it was elected with the campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. William Henry Harrison had defeated a Shawnee prophet at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and his vice president was John Tyler. So the slogan became a prophecy when Harrison died quickly after his inauguration, leaving Tyler to be the first vice to ascend to the presidency in anyone's stead. So many think that Reagan surviving his attempted assassination was the end of the curse. Abraham Lincoln actually had 5 attempts before the last of those failures succeeded 3 days afterward, as part of a conspiracy to decapitate the government and allow the Confederacy to return. An office seeker shot James Garfield because no one would give him the appointment he wanted. Garfield succumbed to his wound a few months later. William McKinley met his end at the point of an anarchist's gun. And finally, a communist sniped John F. Kennedy while he campaigned in Texas for the Civil Rights Act. That's just the most prominent officers who've faced assassination. There have been 14 federal congressmen killed while serving their roles. Most were in the line of fire or by dueling, but 3 were assassinated. Another 9 were assassinated after having been congressmen, but I'll avoid detailing all of those. The first was James Hind, shot by Ku Kluxers for supporting civil rights. Huey Long passed a redistricting that would oust a judge. The official's son shot him mere minutes afterward. Finally, Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother, was killed on the campaign trail for his support of Israel during the Six-Day War. Probably most important to our current situation was an attempt in 1856, which portended the Civil War. After Charles Sumner gave a vociferous speech denouncing the South's push to expand slavery into Kansas, Senator Preston Brooks viciously beat him with a cane on the floor, backed by 2 gun-wielding Southerners. Sumner survived, but was bedridden for over a year and was never the same after the attack. Violence in Congress wasn't unheard of. There'd already been a few brawls and several duels, but this was different. A man beat another half to death on the Senate floor purely for his political opinions, and the nation took sides. Northerners claimed the entire South was complicit, while Southerners sent replacement canes to Brooks because he'd broken it over Sumner's head. 5 years later, the bloodiest war in our history erupted, which had been preceded by nasty conflicts like Bloody Kansas and would be followed by all the violence of Redeemer's bloody resistance to Reconstruction and the decade of lynchings and racial massacres meant to prevent black equality. The caning of Sumner exposed the exact sectional tensions which detonated so much violence. And that is exactly what worries me now. Not the existence of assassinations, but the climate of tolerance for political violence for which we have become accustomed to. What has been particularly interesting in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's murder is all the MAGA denouncements of political violence while simultaneously denying their complicity by calling for exactly that themselves, even literally calling for civil war. Long before this current assassination, Trump has essentially gifted Preston Brooks his cane back, so we shouldn't be surprised by the spate of political violence. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Outside of Congress and the president, there's been tons of assassinations in U.S. history. 4 American governors have been killed in the line of duty. New Mexico's first American governor, Charles Bent, became a victim of the Taos Uprising in 1847, allowing his family to escape through a hole in their wall. In Dakota Territory, a banker shot Edwin Stanton McCook over an argument about the railroad. An unknown assailant sniped Kentucky Governor William Goebel during an election fraud dispute. A whopping 35 state or territorial legislatures have been killed while in office, too many to recount. The first was in 1782, probably by Loyalists, and as recently as a few months ago, when a MAGA gunman went hunting Democrats and killed Melissa Hortman and her husband, along with wounding a few others. For some reason, we didn't put flags at half-mast for those Minnesota killings. We've even had false flag assassinations, like in Idaho when a miner tried to implicate the Union by blowing up Frank Sternenberg, even though the bomber was actually a management informant. There have been 9 mayors killed, including Anton Cernak, who took a bullet meant for President-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Of those 9, Joseph Smith was technically lynched, which I detailed in this episode, and 2 were interpersonal murders. At least 3 federal judges have been killed for their rulings, and 6 state or territorial level judges as well. One of those territorial judges, John Slough, was the beginning of a spate of assassinations here in New Mexico. Prominent historian of American violence, Richard Maxwell Brown, wrote, "New Mexico before World War I was probably the only American state where assassination became a routine political tactic. In my dissertation, I detail that strain of violence, which was largely about Republicans consolidating control of the territory under a corrupt racket called the Santa Fe Ring, and the assassinations included victims such as Albert Jennings Fountain and Pat Garrett. Dozens died in all of the violence that these assassinations were part of, from the Colfax and Lincoln County Wars to the Bandit Troubles. Plenty of my episodes are based on my research about all this, and that's a reason why I could produce this one so quickly. I have a playlist of all the stuff that's based on my own original research. We had a recent local assassination plot from a Republican trying to hire a hitman to massacre his opponents. Some traditions never die, I guess. During the Gilded Age, corrupt leaders became targets. James Fisk was one of the most prominent robber barons, having begun as a railroad mogul, but tried to corner the gold market in a scheme with Jay Gould through influence they had with President Ulysses S. Grant in 1869. That ultimately failed, but caused a bit of a panic. 3 years later, a man trying to blackmail him killed him. A prominent attempt was connected with McKinley. Henry Clay Frick was the chairman of the Carnegie Steel Company. He was partly responsible for the dam failure that caused the Johnston flood and killed over 2,200 people. Then he tried to violently suppress the Homestead strike by sicking Pinkertons on protesters, who were merely calling for an 8-hour workday. In order to halt the fighting, the militia had to be called out. A prominent anarchist barged into Frick's office and shot him in the neck, but Frick not only survived, but fought back. That anarchist was a lover of Emma Goldman, and she was the most influential anarchist who had spoken to McKinley's killer. Many of the corporate or union leader assassinations since then have been mob hits, or people angry at the policies or wealth these figures represent. Just last year, a shooter who had his insurance claims rejected killed CEO of United Healthcare, Brian Thompson. Assassinations accelerated during the 1960s and 70s as a byproduct of the political upheaval from the civil rights movement. Besides the increase in lynchings, there was also a massive increase in assassinations. First was Congress of Racial Equality Corps activist William Lewis Moore, shot by an unknown assassin in 1963. 3 weeks later, a white supremacist shot Medgar Evers, a National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, activist. Mississippi Klansmen killed 3 more activists a year later as they drove through the state. The following year, members of the Nation of Islam shot Black Power activist Malcolm X, who had once been a member of their organization. 1966, Klansmen killed another NAACP leader named Vernon Dahmer. Same thing in 67 with Warlist Jackson. And just a few months after that, a rejected neo-Nazi murdered his former leader, George Lincoln Rockwell. Then came the shooting of Martin Luther King, figurehead of the entire nonviolent civil rights movement. He moved decisively against the Vietnam War and was seeking financial redress of historical wrongs. He'd had numerous attempts on his life by then, and a sniper finally hit his mark, igniting a firestorm of race riots across the nation. Violent crimes began to spike in the 1960s and would reach their peak in 1980 and 91 respectively. Race riots ignited cities throughout the decade due to the lack of progress. Alongside this, many terrorist groups from the Minutemen to Weather Underground lynched, murdered, and bombed their enemies. In response to this intensifying brutality, President Lyndon Baines Johnson commissioned a study on the causes and prevention of violence, which essentially kickstarted my particular subfield of history. Its key conclusion was, violence is like a fever in the body politic. It is but the symptom of some more basic pathology which must be cured before the fever will dissipate. A later historian would kind of rephrase this with his thesis based on preliminary assumptions from the commission and deeper homicide research, correlations between increases in homicide rates and changes in people's feelings about government and society. Keep that in mind for later, because that is the crux of why so many people are outright misinterpreting or misrepresenting the current problem. In 1969, another former Nation of Islam activist met the same fate as Malcolm X, though we do not know who was the culprit there. That year, Chicago police, in conjunction with the FBI, attacked Black Panther chairman Fred Hampton while they slept, killing two, including Chairman Fred. I reviewed the movie about that, by the way. Philadelphia would do worse more than a decade later, bombing a neighborhood to annihilate a Black Power group. So we do have state-sponsored assassinations in our history as well. Numerous tribal leaders were essentially assassinated in the 19th century, such as Mangus Coloradus or Crazy Horse, both killed in custody after surrendering. There's just so many Indian wars that it's difficult to count the number of assassinations among them, but I have covered many in previous episodes. Plus, there's a whole series of foreign assassinations that the United States undertook, starting with Isoroku Yamamoto in 1943, because he had commanded the Pearl Harbor attacks. During the Vietnam War, there was the Phoenix program, which assassinated several Viet Cong and NVA leaders. The CIA has sponsored innumerable assassinations and coups throughout South and Central America and the Caribbean, as well as a spattering of nations across the world. The global war on terror brought the targeted killings of terrorist leaders, something that's increased as troop presence in foreign countries have decreased. So in a very real way, the small amount of domestic assassinations pale in comparison to the number of government-orchestrated assassinations on a regular basis. Where still, there is our material support of numerous countries that are committing atrocities, most recently Israel, and we continue to do so after every possible organization has labeled their extermination of Palestinians a genocide. So I will conveniently avoid detailing all of that, since it is not exactly germane to the current concerns over political violence, even though, yeah, the definition should probably include it. Anyways, in the 70s, there was an attempt on rabid segregationist William Wallace, and a gunman killed Mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone, alongside the first out-of-the-closet gay elected official, Harvey Milk. So throughout the 60s and 70s, there was an incredible increase in political violence, and it didn't exactly end as the United States shifted rightward following the ascendancy of neoliberalism at the end of what one historian called the pivotal decade. Such assassinations continued, but slowed. A crazed gunman murdered John Lennon, who had become quite a political figure. A white supremacist group called The Order, or Silent Brotherhood, gunned down a Jewish shock jock in Denver. I have an episode on that group coming soon, by the way. In the 1990s, violent crime rates plummeted, eventually falling below 1950s levels in the mid-2000s. There are numerous arguments about the causes, which could be more effective law enforcement, mass incarceration, satisfaction with government, the end of Cold War tensions, alongside some falsehoods which the public really gloms onto, like lead poisoning or abortion, both of which are definitely incorrect. In either case, we saw a slight increase starting in 2014 and a sharp spike during the pandemic that has quickly declined since. Political violence does not precisely follow homicide rates. Mass shootings have risen since the 90s, contrary to the general decline in crime rates of other sorts. I detailed the problem in the epilogue to my dissertation, which I turned into an episode, and I think anyone attempting to understand American violence will benefit from watching or reading that. Often we jump to mental health or gun ownership to explain this, which is a false dilemma. Neither of these changed in the 2000s. Heck, gun control was at its height under the so-called assault weapons ban, and psychiatric services have become easier to procure over the exact period of increased mass shootings. Instead, we must look at a more systemic issue. As the Violence Project phrases it, a mass shooting is a unique form of suicide, an angry one meant to cause as much harm as possible. So what are the hardships driving so many Americans to choose to end their own lives? Neoliberalism has steadily increased economic inequality to the point that people under 40 will likely never afford a house or possess a steady living. Combine that with the easy access of weaponry and knowledge of previous shooters, and the cause of mass shootings in general becomes kinda obvious. It's also the same root cause of our political polarization, which I have a series of episodes on that. Assassinations are likely part of this trend. Many mass shooters are explicitly enacting some political manifesto they often post beforehand, and there's been 2 attempts and 1 successful assassination that were exactly mass shootings. First was in 2011, which attacked Gabby Giffords while she held a rally in Tucson. The shooter fired at point-blank range and continued into the crowd, killing 6. Giffords survived and had to resign from Congress due to her injuries. While at a church service in 2015, a white supremacist teenager killed 9, including South Carolina legislator and pastor Clementa Pinckney. 2 years later, a leftist shot a congressional baseball team while they practiced, injuring 6. 2 months after that, a neo-Nazi rammed his car through counter-protesters at an alt-right rally, killing 1. A bomber mailed 16 packages to prominent critics of Trump in 2018, including Obama and Biden. But the pandemic seemed to accelerate assassination attempts. Police brutality caused a spate of race riots, both of which I've covered elsewhere, but that was rising social violence, not specifically assassinations. Some MAGA-aligned militiamen plotted to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Trump denied the free and fair election that followed, which resulted in the January 6th insurrection, where more MAGA-aligned militiamen besieged the Capitol while Congress certified the very election they sought to overturn. Many claimed that they wanted to lynch the vice president because he supported the Constitution over loyalty to Trump. Perhaps because of that inordinate transgression, Americans refrained from assassinations for 3 years, though more than 60 died in political violence during that time. The ADL claimed all of the perpetrators were right-wingers. There was an abortive attempt on Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh regarding overturning Roe v. Wade. The very person who instigated the insurrection gained the Republican nomination last year to run again. 2 people attempted to assassinate him before the election, one piercing his ear with a bullet and killing a firefighter behind him. His photo of rising and yelling "fight" became the definitive image of his resurgence and eventual winning of the election. He'd actually had 3 attempts before that, but they were mostly of no particular importance. citizens, nor were the several attempts on his opponents as well. Minor incidents are extraordinarily common. They just didn't go anywhere. The ear-piercing and triumphal imagery was what mattered, though there had been an estimated 74% uptick in political violence during this election cycle. After the election came the healthcare CEO's assassination. A troubled veteran detonated himself in a Tesla Cybertruck at Trump's Las Vegas hotel on the first day of 2025, creating yet another iconic image for the current state of political violence. On the first day of Trump's second administration, he pardoned all 1,500 convicted insurrectionists. This, more than anything else, okayed political violence, at least if committed on behalf of this current regime. As ICE raids and political persecution increased, destroying liberty itself, someone firebombed Governor Josh Shapiro's home. A MAGA gunman took a hit list in hand to kill political opposition in Minnesota. He killed only one politician, Melissa Hortman, and her husband. Outside of assassinations, there have also been multiple attacks on ICE facilities. There was even an ISIS-associated terrorist attack ramming a truck through a crowd in New Orleans. Mass shootings have continued apace, most of which that are politically motivated are related to right-wing grievances, especially the whole Great Replacement lie. Something which the Trump administration has continued to perpetuate, even going so far as to claim that there is white genocide going on in South Africa, which is definitely false. And then on top of that, Trump violated the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act by ordering the military into Los Angeles, despite local law enforcement being perfectly capable of dealing with what was happening there. He then militarized Washington, D.C. and is planning to further expand his despotism.
We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military. It's a war from within.
He even openly contemplated ethnically cleansing Gaza and invading several foreign countries purely for territorial gains, both being obvious war crimes. Plus, there's the war crimes of bombing Venezuelan speedboats. And finally, an anti-fascist unaffiliated with any organization killed reactionary podcaster Charlie Kirk. In response, MAGA called for the extermination of their enemies and perhaps the worst crackdown on freedom of speech this country has seen since the Red Scares. I have an enormous episode on red baiting coming up soon, which is well over 2 hours. Yet, reactionaries have to lie about the prevalence of left-wing violence. The administration literally deleted a study proving that rightists are far more dangerous because they wanted political violence. It is an absolute fact that most of the political violence committed by civilians in this country comes from the right, not liberals or leftists. One think tank attempted to spin this year as the left overtaking the right in violence, but their deceitful methodology falls apart when you realize that this is the graph they're basing it all on, with literally only one incident as rightist, that being the Hortman assassination. Nothing about the New Mexican hitman plot or Pennsylvania firebombing, let alone all the unlawful state-sanctioned violence or MAGA militia actions. It also claims Thompson's assassination and anything currently with unknown motivation is left-wing, which is ludicrous. We do not have enough data to make claims about the current year, since the FBI releases that every August, and under its current leadership, even that cannot be relied upon. As historian of right-wing violence Kathleen Bellew wrote, "In this moment of elevated danger for critiques of the administration, especially the attempt to designate Antifa as a terrorist group, it is not a group, it is incredibly irresponsible to circulate these pieces of analysis without their context." Scary enough, Trump officially claimed that common threads animating this violent conduct include anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, race, and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views of family, religion, and morality. And then he mandated that these be persecuted as terrorism. Yes, he's basically labeling trans people, civil rights activists, and leftists of any sort as state enemies. In one document that purports to be fighting political violence, it gives the worst license for political violence we have seen from a president since at least the Second World War, if not going back further than that. Of course, such nebulously defined terminology allowed this administration to release a hit list of politicians who had the fortitude to criticize his tyranny. The deceptive CSIS report allows the Trump administration to go right down the steps of the narcissist's prayer as they themselves call for violence, while pretending that denouncing MAGA's rising authoritarianism and bigotry is somehow the real problem. Those who deny atrocities wish for them to recur. And sadly, that is where we are today. Now, in this summary of events, many of you may have noticed that there's plenty of instances that I've omitted. Many simply didn't fit the working semantics here, such as the spate of rappers lethally beefing, or how about the Puerto Rican nationalists who shot up the congressional floor and made a major attack on the presidential residence. You're welcome to post some I missed in the comments below. There's simply too much to be comprehensive here. American history is riddled with assassinations and social violence of all sorts. I'm a historian who studies this exact topic, and I know all too well that our nation is built on innumerable funeral pyres. Hopefully this brief recounting convinces you that all these pleas we hear about violence has no place here are short-sighted. Not only does violence have a place in American history, it most certainly does, it is the mantelpiece I will never want for material to study. The United States has always been based in blood. As soon as we can accept that, the sooner we may attempt to ameliorate it. Remember what the LBJ Commission said? Violence is like a fever in the body politic and all that? Perhaps my most repeated phrase is, violence is a manifestation of change. So what was changing in the 1850s through 70s to cause such bloodshed? Ending slavery and the fight to bequeath civil rights on freemen. Duh. How about the 1960s? Well, that was civil rights again. But what is changing now, though? Well, I think it's necessary to take a much broader view than merely the individual victims or perpetrators. Remember my theory about the breakdown of neoliberalism being the root of mass shootings? Same goes for assassinations. I already made a series of episodes on how our politics became so polarized. This current strain of violence is a result of that polarization. As I concluded there, at the very least, we can be aware of what brought us to this point. One thing is for certain, we've chosen this fate. The party switch set us on this path. The culture war furnished dishonest rhetoric for Reaganites to take over. Neoliberalism was Reagan's economic policy that sowed the discontent we've polarized over since 2011, and technology accelerated that polarization to the point of disrupting the peaceful transition of power, which has differentiated us from so many failing countries before. We cannot look at one event or issue throughout this entire series and say that is where it all began. Polarization has been a steady process throughout the sixth party system. The question is, will we continue to fail? That's what everyone is missing here. Assassinations and political violence aren't rising because of specific sides, but because we have willingly fallen into a system that encourages increasing hatred. Vice President Vance is correct that
this is not a both sides problem. If both sides have a problem, one side has a much bigger and malignant problem, and that is the truth we must be told.
Where he's drastically wrong is what shape those sides take.
People on the left are much likelier to defend and celebrate political violence. This is not a both sides problem.
Firstly, political violence comes primarily from the right. Before this Kirk killing, there was obviously the assassination of a Minnesota Democrat and her husband. That was followed by exactly the same people decrying posts finding levity in Kirk's assassination, doing the very thing they decry. One attempt I've purposely avoided thus far was the attempt on Nancy Pelosi, resulting in the traumatic injury of her husband. The very people assaulting free speech on behalf of Kirk, demanding that the nation collectively mourn and revere him, refuse to analyze his actual words and deeds, but that's too woke to acknowledge who he was, because the hatred he spewed led to his killer's own hatred. So the very same people demanding that we deny the past about Kirk also joked at Paul Pelosi's misfortune and even gloried in it. Every Republican call for decency rings hollow after Trump pardoned the insurrectionaries. There is very clearly one side making things significantly worse, and that's right-wingers. In a decent society, we would not take sides in such a tragedy. There are only two sides to an assassination, the perpetrator and the victim. If you take the perp's side, then you support murder and are therefore a reprehensible human being. If you take the victim's side, then you are just marionetting a corpse. Dead men tell no tales. Martyrs are made into playthings, not representatives of their actual beliefs. Look at Martin Luther King. His strongest stance was that violence begets violence, using the perpetration of violence upon his protests as the strongest repudiation of institutional racism. Yet, riots followed his death, and we've seen people appropriate that as a way to vindicate violence, racism, or both, proclaiming that MLK said,
"A riot is the language of the unheard,"
without saying that he explicitly denounced such violence just minutes beforehand by saying,
"We say, as I've always said, and I will always continue to say, that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating. I'm still convinced that non-violence is the most potent weapon available to oppress people in their struggle for freedom and justice. I feel that violence will only create more social problems than they will solve."
If they forget that part, that shows that people use his martyrdom to support violence in contradiction of his legacy, saying that affirmative action or whatever goes against his principles, which he said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character." Somehow they twist that into him being like against affirmative action or diversity, equity, and inclusion, which that is definitely false, and denies that he sought for some sort of reparation for historical wrongs, especially if that meant some sort of socialism for everyone. Yes, Martin Luther King was a socialist. Saying he supported rioting or opposed affirmative action is a monumental misappropriation of his legacy. But he is no longer here to defend his ideals, despite the massive corpus of advocacy he left behind. Hell, I've seen people liken Kirk to MLK, despite Kirk denouncing on numerous occasions the very civil rights and voting rights acts that MLK so championed. Taking sides in an assassination only supports disinformation. Sadly, what we must understand about our current state of political violence is that we've reached an equivalence in partisanship which had followed the caning of Sumner. By denying the disproportionate rightist violence in this country, the administration has effectively gifted a new cane to Preston Brooks. I mean, I've long agonized over what exactly is the divide that's big enough to cause another civil war that rightists are so fervently calling for. But the biggest divide is progress in and of itself. Shall we regulate business? Shall we tax the rich? Shall we provide a social safety net? Kirk's shooter had no connection to any leftist organization, yet MAGA seeks some demon to persecute, regardless of evidence. So the MAGA movement blames the messenger who's correctly diagnosing the problem rather than their own ill will, and did so even before anything was known about the shooter.
It's a long past time for all Americans and the media to confront the fact that violence and murder are the tragic consequence of demonizing those with whom you disagree day after day, year after year, in the most hateful and despicable way possible. For years, those on the radical left have compared wonderful Americans like Charlie to Nazis and the world's worst mass murderers and criminals. This kind of rhetoric is directly responsible for the terrorism that we're seeing in our country today.
She's a Marxist, communist, fascist, socialist.
This is a radical left Marxist, communist, fascist. This is fascist.
I think this is a different kind of a race. All we have to do is define our opponent as being a communist or a socialist or somebody that's going to destroy our country.
The Democrats, they're fascists. Joe Biden, he's an enemy of the state.
That is why you fail.
Yet that is not support of violence, and portraying any criticism of Charlie Kirk as support of violence is in and of itself a call for violence. If you don't want to be labeled a fascist, stop being a fascist. Hence why so many historians of fascism now identify the second Trump administration as exactly that. We have a long history of trying to reprise assassinations with persecution. After McKinley, Congress passed the Anarchist Exclusion Act, which declared anarchists forbidden from entering the country. Yes, we were doing ideological purity tests, and we actually ended up adding other leftists to that category in 1918. Yet we've never done the same thing with the radical right, like fascists and monarchists. Arguably, the thing that the country was founded to fight against was against monarchy. That's the original meaning of the word Republican. But such a wretched violation of free speech was only rescinded in 1965. Rather than vengeance, many repercussions from assassinations have been unifying and even liberating. After Garfield, Congress passed the Civil Service Reform Act, dismantling much of the spoil system from which his killer had sought to benefit. And after JFK, his successor used the fact that he was campaigning for the new Civil Rights Act to get it passed.
No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
Eliminating much of Jim Crow. Responses to assassination can either be unifying or divisive, seek vengeance or camaraderie. It is up to those in power to choose how they will react to an assassination. Republicans want to continue down the path of political violence that they ultimately created, and now have a martyr to marionette into persecuting dissidents. Ignore the deeper issues of reactionary escalation as we fall deeper into fascism. Instead, we demonize trans people, immigrants, entertainers, and intellectuals. How dare they exist, seek better lives, ridicule power, and try to understand the world. Alles für den Führer. Say otherwise, and your livelihood is next. Tod dem Marxismus. We've already got secret police kidnapping people into concentration camps. Arbeit macht frei. Now it's time to fill those facilities. Es riecht nach Kristallnacht. Assassination only hurts the movement it purports to support. It gives reason to persecute anyone vaguely affiliated. I may have found Kirk to be reprehensible, but murder is even more repugnant. If you take a side in this, you will always be wrong. Worse still, you will also miss the point. Hence why I avoided naming criminals as much as possible here. Step back from the specific motivations of perpetrators or the societal role of victims, and you will see the larger pattern. The reactionary worldview of MAGA has metastasized. Trump campaigned for political violence, literally proclaiming on multiple occasions that he was the embodiment of retribution.
I am your retribution. I am your retribution.
When he pardoned all of those insurrectionaries, we as a nation lapsed into a state of political violence much like the 1960s or 1850s. None of this should be surprising after learning all of this history. Of course, denounce political violence. Of course, you should do so. A decent society never condones murder. But we sadly do not live in a decent society. At least we may take solace in the fact that violence has been worse in the past, like far worse, as we enter this new era of political violence. Political assassinations were far worse in the 1960s and 1850s through 70s. We literally had a civil war already. But always keep in mind that to understand this current strain of violence, you must move beyond the motives of individual perpetrators or the specifics of their victims. Instead, remember that violence is a manifestation of change. Say hello. Oh, thank you. This is King Richard I. Mwah. He's a good boy. He just wants to be around. You want some kitty treats? I got him trained well. The assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1891. I don't think he's that old. And I just realized I don't have any drinks with me, and I am thirsty as heck. Doing this so quickly that I almost forgot that I'm definitely going to need some drinks to get through this. Cheers. Meow. Hi. You got caught. Thank you. This guy's namesake was kind of assassinated. His name is King Richard I, and he was shot by an arrow. He did say that the boy who got him shouldn't be executed for the deed, and then, of course, once he succumbed to his wounds, his knights decided to kill the kid anyways. Oops. And while I'm doing all of this, whoop, isn't that great? I just got to see that. Now you guys do too. It's okay. Hi there. Yeah. The global war on terror. No. Don't know if you guys can tell. I am sweating profusely. This room retains heat like crazy because I'm just that hot. But meow. I have a kitty. Tesla Cybertrunk. He is currently clawing my foot. Can I move my foot? No? It's like, no, you can't. Don't you dare, I'll claw you. I am living under the threat of violence constantly. I mean, just look at that. That is a threat of violence right there. My foot is in danger.